Order. The hearing is now resumed.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I've located that chart that I earlier referred to. It's page 20 of Dr. Morton's report, Exhibit 1976. So if you can just highlight the lower chart there, Mr. Lemon. So I won't spend any more time on that, Mr. Commissioner, but that's, well, I urge upon you that that's the result of simply doing the arithmetical counting that is part of that exhibit that was the stocking chart once you sort and separate for each of the individual farms. The last point I wanted to make on the disclosure matter in relation to the license just before the break is, what's the reason for not giving more information? What I heard BC, the province, say in their argument, and it replicates what we heard in earlier submissions regarding the disclosure of these databases, is in effect just people will misuse this information. They'll take part of it, and they won't be veterinarians, and so they'll misuse it. What I say that amounts to is they don't trust the public. They don't trust people to use the right amount of information. That, in this day and age, is not an answer to non-disclosure. That, yes, partial information can always be misused, but the recipe for public confidence is full disclosure. Let it all come out. And in this particular area, because of the importance scientifically of identifying at the earliest possible occasion trends in various symptoms, I say it's doubly important that it come out, and it ought to be one of your recommendations. I just want to, my next point, I want to spend a couple of minutes on the question of testing. And this is the question of whether testing 4 fish out of a farm that has 500,000 or 1 million fish is an adequate measure of disease. Can I have Exhibit 1566 up on the screen, page 16? This, Mr. Commissioner, is from the Manual of Compliance for the Fish Health Protection Regulations. I'll come back to this page. If we go to the next page, the table that has been, that we refer to in evidence. Now what this table shows is that, and it really is simple mathematical sense, that if you have disease present in a prevalence, say, of 5% or 10%, how many fish do you have to test just on a straight probability theory before you know that you're likely to find it? And the answer is, well, if you've got disease prevalent at 5%, that's 1 fish in 20. Testing 4 fish is not going to find it. Or you're going to be pretty lucky if you find it. So that the rules that have been set out internationally are that you test a minimum of 60 fish. The province's audit program, which has been going on for 10 years, has tested roughly 4 to 5 fish per audit. So that's 400 or 500 fish per year, and these are tested. The chances of that finding, say, hypothetically, ISA, if that was present at a 5% rate on 1 farm or 2 farms, is very, very low. Now I think I heard my friend for the province suggest that Well, they didn't have to follow that number because they were testing, by testing fresh silvers, they were somehow stacking the odds in their favor so that that probability theory didn't apply. And they said that according to the fish health protection regulations, that was okay. So I want to just take you back to the page before because I think that's a misunderstanding of what the document says. So if we could just highlight the paragraph under selecting the sample. The first sentence, Mr. Commissioner, says that at a detectable, to get a 95% probability of detecting something, at a detectable infection of 5 or 10%, you have to follow that table, which I just showed you. But if you look 5 lines from the bottom of that paragraph, the direction is that to take a sample from any given unit must consist of as many moribund and freshly dead fish as are available. So this is not a question of saying we can ignore the table as long as we're testing freshly dead fish. This is a question where the very direction upon which the table depends directs that be done. That if you can't do that, the numbers should go higher. If we could have Exhibit 1567 up on the screen. Now this was another document that was put to the witnesses during the hearings, Mr. Commissioner, and it says the same, more or less the same things. I think my friend for the province referred to this as something from an unknown person at the University of Iowa. This comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Manual, International Response to Infectious Salmon Anemia, Prevention, Control, and Eradication. This is the U.S. standard for testing. This is what, when we talk in December, the U.S. is going to be applying to our approach. If I might have, Mr. Lund, the transcript from August 31st, at page 55. Is it possible to get that?
Yes.
The next point I'm going to show you, Mr. Commissioner, is the cross-examination of not cross-examination. Well, this was examination by Ms. Callan for the province of Dr. Marty. In respect to this very question, whether testing of 60 fish was adequate or not. And here's what he said, if you could go to line 28 and below. Above that, he says that for young fry, where they're testing the sort of freshly hatched eggs, they do follow that standard. But he says the audit program is quite different. The audit program, the goal of that program is to audit the fish health events that are reported by industry. So we are not attempting to certify any individual farm free from disease. And that's quite right. Then he says, however, that he thinks you can add these up. So you have a farm on the east coast of Vancouver Island, and then you have a farm in the Seashell, and then you have a farm over in Vancouver Island, and if you add those up to get the 60, that somehow you're complying with this. I say, Mr. Commissioner, and in my respectful submission, that's plainly wrong, unless you assume that the rate of ISA or some other disease is exactly identical through every fish farm. That's not going to give you any probability analysis. If you assume that each fish farm is an independent population, you have to test them independently. So this may give the province some comfort when they aggregate all of these over many years. But as a matter of science, that's simply not supportable. If you want to know whether a given fish farm in the Discovery Islands has ISA, you have to test 60 fish to get even to a 95% probability. If hypothetically, for instance, you were to test 48 fish and find that 2 of them had ISA, that would be a prevalence of 4%. To be lucky enough to find that same sample in a fish farm, if they had the same amount of ISA, you'd have to test 60 fish. So that when we hear that 4,000 or 5,000 fish were tested over the last 8 or 10 years, That's a phony statistic. It's accurate, but it's phony. It's meaningless because it doesn't tell us what the probability of finding ISA or any other disease on any given farm is. Testing for fish per farm is completely inadequate. When we ask, when the next new disease is found, when we ask, how did we not find that? There's the answer. And if I could just have, to go back to page 44 in the same transcript. Again, it's Dr. Marty's examination, in this case by Canada. And here you'll see, Mr. Commissioner, that Dr. Marty was dealing with the fact that of SSC, or sinusoidal congestion, and why his own document referred to that as a classic lesion of ISA, and he says at line 20, I also include a clause after that, but ISAV has never been identified in British Columbia. So his entire basis of the assumption, his whole project is based on, well, if you find these symptoms, but you can say ISAV has never been detected in British Columbia, then you have some reliability that you don't have to go beyond that. If and when that turns out to be incorrect, we have to go back to this database and readdress the entire situation. And this brings me to another point. I think my learned friends for the fish farmers in Canada and BC have all, in common, said, you have to trust the experts. That you have to trust veterinarians to make veterinarian decisions. Well, every one of these experts told you there's no ISA in British Columbia, and we're highly confident there never will be. I think my friend for the fish farmers used that phrase in his argument. They were highly confident that disease was not a problem. That's used by Dr. Marty exactly to that effect. He says, we're highly confident we have no ISAV. And yet somehow the experts are wrong, or can be wrong, or will be wrong. And that's not unusual. That's happened in industry after industry, event after event. Experts are not gods. They can give you the best indication or their best opinion, but somehow nature confounds them over and over again. So when I come back to the question of why don't you send your kids to school in an explosives plant? Even if the experts tell you it's highly regulated, it'll never blow up because it hasn't blown up before. That's not enough. The question of risk versus proof of harm is the key question for you. There is no question that risk is proven here. The risk of disease is real. It's definable. It's scientifically provable. Will the explosive plant blow up? I don't know. Will the nuclear plant blow up or get a leak? Well, I don't know how many experts I've heard over the years tell me that can't happen, and yet we have Japan. Why don't we site nuclear plants downtown Vancouver? The experts tell us there's no risk at all. The risk is infinitesimal. But we still understand it makes no sense to put them there, because even if there's a very low risk, you put them in other places where you don't put them in the middle of a migratory route of wild sockeye. So that's why I want to turn next to sighting. Could I have exhibit 1563 on the screen? For some reason, 10 years ago or more, the powers that be in the province chose to site a huge number of fish farms in the most congested place on the west coast for the migratory route of the wild salmon. What a silly place to put it. The only possible justification for putting it there could be that one wasn't even thinking about this issue. And that, in fact, is the case. Do you have the province's argument available? Page 83? Mr. Commissioner, because it's a convenient place. This citing, this is a list of the citing criteria that you've seen on a number of occasions. It's also present in the PPR 20 at page 45, and it's present in a number of other exhibits. The evidence before you has been, these are the criteria that was being used to cite all of those fish farms, all of those explosive plants, right in the middle of the wild salmon migration route. Not one word in that document about wild sockeye and its migration route. The suggestion from my friends that somehow there's been a detailed assessment of that risk and nobody thought to write it down is, my suggestion, not responsible. The suggestion that somehow when you'd put a fish farm more than a kilometer away from the site of one individual coho stream, but that you put it in the middle of millions of migrating wild salmon, it makes no logical sense. I think in my submission the right answer is no one was thinking about it. The science hadn't been done. The full knowledge of the extent of risk wasn't there. Before I leave this, because I'm going to move next to the SIA assessments to show you what I mean, but if you could just highlight the opening words to that sentence. This is the province's position. Since the transition, the province retains jurisdiction over siting decisions. Now, the only legal argument I'm going to make to you all day, Mr. Commissioner, is that's simply wrong. In terms of Mr. Justice Hinkson's decision, the province has jurisdiction over the seafloor, so they need to give a lease to any fish farm that is done. But the federal government has the jurisdiction over the siting decision in terms of its impact on wild salmon. But I don't believe this is a typographical error. This is the way the process is occurring now. The federal government simply defers to the province around siting. That's wrong. The province isn't looking at wild salmon, or Fraser River sockeye, at least, that's clear. And I suppose nor should they. It's not their jurisdiction. But the federal government should, and they aren't. If I could have Exhibit 1630 up on the screen. Exhibit 1630 is the SIA assessment for Conville Bay, Mr. Commissioner. You also have Exhibit 1629, which is Dunsterville, which if you look at it, you'll find is in identical words. The suggestion that somehow there's a complex biological assessment by a whole host of habitat biologists is not correct. This stuff is simply cut and pasted into an environmental assessment. If we could go to page 4, please. Under biophysical environment, you'll see that aspect, not one word about the fact that this is part of the wild salmon migration. If we could go to page 9. Here you'll see in the third column, Mr. Commissioner, that this is the sum total of the assessment by Canadian authorities, and this is actually the Ministry of Transport, not the Department of Fisheries, but under the Ministry of Transport. This is the sum total of the assessment of the disease risk. And can we just look at the mitigation measures? Under the salmon importation policy, smolts cannot be transported, only fertilized eggs. I say what this is based on the assumption that, well, if we can rely on the export or the import policy that we're not bringing any exotic diseases in, we're fine. Same with introduction and transfer policies in the second paragraph. The third paragraph says a fish health management plan is required to address issues of fish health and takes into account interactions with wild fish. And The fourth paragraph says, site, vessel, and visitor-related fish health protocols and disinfection will be followed according to the industry-wide protocols. Now, my submission to you, Mr. Commissioner, is the fish health management plan and the site, vessel, and visitor-related in-health protocols are all fine and good. They're all about making sure that diseases that exist in the fish farm won't be transferred to another fish farm. They're not about keeping disease from the wild salmon. They do absolutely nothing for that. We have a fairly bizarre structure here where if a farm is experiencing a disease outbreak, there are rules that say if I dip my boot in the water and I have a few drops of water on my boot, I have to disinfect it. It's that dangerous before I get on a boat. Meanwhile, the very water I was dipping my boot into, the wild fish are fully exposed to and swimming through. In Norway, the papers that I put forward to you the primary way to protect from disease is to prevent horizontal transmission by putting fish farms far enough away, 4 kilometers or 5 kilometers or 6 kilometers away. The idea being that they can't cross-transfer disease if we put them that far away. But the fish swimming in between them have no protection at all. There's simply no consideration. Can we go to page 12, please? Oh, I'm sorry, page 16. If I could just highlight the paragraph on the bottom right. This talks about the potential transmission of disease. Pathogens that originate in salmon farms, and this table is dealing with cumulative impact, so the idea that there's more than one fish farm. And it says it's not likely to have significant cumulative impacts. Uncertainty exists with respect to the migratory patterns of salmonids along the channels in the area and on effects associated with groups of salmonids migrating past multiple farm sites. Measures outlined in the company's fish health management plans reduce the likelihood of transmission. That's the extent of examination that these farms got back when they were passed. Uncertainty exists. We don't know if there are fish migrating past these farms at all. And we certainly don't know what the effects are of multiple farms. And that accords with all of the evidence. The science on that hadn't been done and hasn't been done today. And yet those farms were approved without any other examination whatsoever. You recall when I asked senior officials at DFO, who in your department is responsible for this? The deputy minister referred that question to science. And the head of science said, well, nobody at our place. There is no one who's been responsible for doing that. The single most important recommendation you can make, Mr. Commissioner, in my respectful submission, is get those farms out of that area.